An in-depth look at Align, Lesson 2. My name is Barry Kimball. This lesson will demonstrate how to use the Align tool to establish continuity between two surfaces, utilize various options to optimize the alignment results, and how to control higher levels of continuity. In this lesson, we'll discuss how to establish and adjust tangent and curvature continuity. In addition, we'll discuss options that provide control over surface CV layouts. The key learning objectives are adjusting the blend option, setting tangency and curvature, using edge, skew, and scale manipulators, and using the partial option. This lesson will start by discussing some options within the Align tool that can be used to maintain or control the CV layout of a surface. So here we have a set of surfaces that we previously modified and achieved positional continuity. But what I don't like about this alignment that we created is that it's a rapid change right at the end of this surface. I would like to move all of these CVs a little bit so that the structure looks a little bit better when I'm finished. To add a little bit to that, I'd like to turn on some additional data that shows a little more about how this surface came to be. We have 1, 2, 3 surfaces, and this kind of is making a transition in between them. So I'd like to take this amount of movement that we made at this end, so we moved from here to here, and I would like to taper that throughout here. To do that, we can use the blending function. So I'm going to select Object Edit, Query Edit, and select this surface. This is the same surface from the previous lesson. I'll turn the blending on, and a couple of options appear, the extra CV rows and the blend factor. The extra CV rows are additional rows of CVs that will be modified based on the original movement. So I would like to modify 4 rows, and I'm selecting 4 because maybe this row I like, or maybe this row is already positional to another surface that we don't see, but I'd like to modify 4 rows. A side note, if no movement happens at a CV at the edge, so these 2 points weren't modified by the align function. So even though these are highlighted, these CVs will have no effect. There'll be no movement to these CVs. All the CVs in the middle, though, have been modified. And that looks like a pretty good modification. And how does the software know how far to modify this one? That's the blend factor. So it's the amount of taper that happens to the CVs as they move away from the base CV movement. So if I set this to 0, this control vertice move to get to its position, maybe from here to here. So then it's going to move all the extra rows that same value. So no taper. If this control vertice moved 10, this control vertice will move 10. Okay. With the blend factor set to 1, that's tapering now. So it's not a distance, it's just a tapering value. So as it moves away from the base point where the base edge was aligned, it tapers off. Okay. 1 again is tapering. 0 is no taper, the same movement. So if we went minus 0.5, that's move a distance in addition to what the base point moved. So we can add extra movement in. Now, it may look like you never want that, but sometimes that can be useful. So 0 is equal movement. Negative numbers are movement equal to plus additional movement, and 1 is taper. 95% of the time I have this set to 1, but just so you just so you can see, if you Alt key and slide in here, you can modify those numbers a little bit. Now, I mentioned an option before that I always have set, and I'd like to show again why I like to have that option set. Alt key sliding in this menu, I can't see any movements in between. I can only see the current position when I let go. So if I go to Preferences, Performance Options, and turn During Transform on, now as I slide the slider bar, I can see the points move. And I can adjust the amount of taper that I want. Alt key and slide with the left mouse button in there gives me precise control. And again, usually 1 is a good number. Okay? So now I'd like to discuss some higher levels of continuity, and those would be the tangent and curvature continuity levels. So I'm going to close this align function, and we're going to check the continuity along this edge and this edge, because those should be curvature continuous. So to check that continuity, we're going to use the Surface Evaluate continuity checker. Select this edge. It's still curvature. Even though we modified these control vertices, it's still curvature. And this edge, we've lost our continuity. So this is another place where the align function can be used to repair some continuity. We'll go into the Object Edit Align, and I'll select this edge, and it asks me for the pick chooser. So I want to modify this surface, and it says this surface already has history. Do you want to remove that history? Currently, we have an alignment established between these two surfaces. We can't then establish an alignment between these two surfaces without modifying the control vertices that are being, I guess right now, controlled by this alignment. So software is telling us we have to choose. So yes, we want to make a modification, and we want to modify this side. And one more selection, and now we get positional continuity. But we would like to specify that continuity check and ask for a curvature check. So in fact, we can still see it didn't really change it. It just established a positional alignment. So to achieve a higher level of continuity, we'll go over and ask for tangency with the left mouse button. And we have tangency. And you can see with this locator still on, we still have positional continuity over here. So we haven't really moved this CV. Next, we'll ask for curvature continuity. And we get curvature continuity, but it sacrifices the positional continuity of this edge. So I'm going to zoom in here, and we'll examine that. So what it's showing is that some modification was required to this control vertice that moved it away from here to gain curvature. So there's a couple of choices we could make. One, we could select this CV and move it over to this one. That would fix it. Two, we could delete this history and snap this CV over to here and see if we maintain curvature in this direction. The third option is the edge boundary control. So at the outer edges of the surface, we have boundary control constraints. So that is if this edge is continuous with this edge. Now that's in addition to the two surfaces being continuous on their face, because right now they're continuous on their face. But we could also tell the software that I would like to skew this edge, and by selecting this arrow manipulator, we could bend this surface away. Now these two edges are not continuous, but this face is still continuous. So I'm going to move that back to edge because I'd like these to be continuous. I'm going to go to this edge and select skew. So what this is telling us is that the software can place this CV in a spot and have curvature continuity on the face, but there's just some edge curvature that's in error. And I'm going to accept that because I like this surface's edge shape. We had already decided that. Okay. Now, in addition to the outer edge controls of skew and curvature, we can also now, with our tangent and curvature sliders, affect the CV shapes. So we have a couple of arrows here for tangent and curvature movement. So the software will allow me to select the middle arrow and move an entire row. Okay, I'm going to Control Z, and that allows me to undo steps within the align. But what I would like to do is smooth this structure out a little bit and get rid of this taper between these two. So I'm going to adjust this slider, and that tapers that modification from one end to the other. Then I could grab the tangent row and slide it, and while I'm sliding the tangent row, you can see that the curvature row also moves. That's because it's continually updating. We have our performance set options set to during transform. So I'm going to place this CV in a spot where I like it, or that row in a spot where I like it, and I think that looks pretty good. I'd like to continue now and discuss some more applications for the blending option. For this demonstration, I'd like to use this wheel flare, and let's just say as a design change we wanted to move this wheel arch outboard, I don't know, some distance. And now, instead of rebuilding or recreating all these surfaces, I'd like to modify the existing geometry. I call that surface restructuring, but rather than recreate, I like to modify if I can. I already have a lot of continuity set up here between all these other patches, so rather than trying to rebuild all of that at the same time as making this modification, I'll just make this simple modification using the align function. So to do that, we'll select the edge that we want to modify first, and the edge that we'd like to modify that to. So you can see that it's made the modification, but it's done it in kind of a crazy way. It's matched this entire edge. So what I would like to do is only match the edge, the portion where it was lying before. So to do that, we'll use a partial option. So the partial option allows me to control how much of this boundary the alignment uses. Now we could zoom in here, and if I didn't like that location, I could move to the left or to the right by using this little manipulator. But I kind of like the solution that it came up with. How did it know where to go? It measures the closest distance from this point to this edge and just snaps it to it. That's where it comes up with its base partial location. Okay. Now, in addition to that movement, I'd like to modify the rest of the surface, because now if we look at this from the rear view, we have a totally different sectional shape. Previously, we had this positive crown, and now it's all negative. So I'd like to match the original shape as best I can. I'll use the blending option, and we'll blend 2 extra rows. Now, one thing I'd like to point out, and a thing that I like about the extra rows option, is it's specific. So I can tell the software exactly how many extra rows I want to modify. Now that's good, because I don't want to modify this curvature, tangent, or positional row, because I've already set up that continuity to the other side. So it gives the user precise control over how much modification is going to happen. Now when we look at this from the rear view again, I have added in some positive to this surface by turning the blending on, but it's not quite the same, I don't think. The angle appears like this is tilted over more than this. This comes up at this angle. This isn't quite the same. So I'm going to set the blend factor to 0. Now by setting the blend factor to 0, the amount of CV movement that the bottom CV moved, so this CV, we'll call it the base CV, it moved a certain distance. This one moved the same, and this one moves the same. How can we verify that? Well, there's a couple methods. One, we could duplicate this boundary, set the pivot to this point, and move it to this new location. Now if I turn the CVs on for this surface, we can see that they sit right on top of one another. Okay, so we have a curve and a surface, and those last CVs are all right on one another. Another way to check that would be to turn this surface on, get its control vertices. I'm just going to delete this curve really quick, and we'll use a locator measured distance, and we'll check the distance that the bottom point moved by using the control key left mouse button and checking those two control vertices, and then we can move up and check the rest. Oops. And we can see that each control vertex moved the exact same amount. That's because our blend factor was set to 0. So 0 taper. Okay? So that gives us a nice section shape now. I'll delete those locators. Reopen the align function. And we'll make this modification. Okay? So since these 2 points were lined up before, they'll be lined up now because it made the same distance, the same placement at the end. The partial is already turned on. I'll turn the blending and the extra rows on to 2. But one thing to notice is that it increased the degree of this surface. How did it know what degree to change it to? It matched the degree of this surface. So we could turn on explicit control and have user control over what that change is. So now we're saying I want that only to be degree 6. It's the same degree when you just turn it on. It's the same degree as it was prior to any modification. So we could drop that down to 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever number we wanted. I'm going to leave it alone because it already had continuity along this edge, so I don't want to change it. I would just like to keep that surface the same other than this modification we're currently making. So I'll set the blend factor to 0. Okay. Pick nothing. We'll modify this surface to this edge. We have explicit control on. We'll turn on the blending. 2 rows. Set our blend factor. And modify the last surface. I'd like to turn on all the CVs so that we can just take a look at kind of this global change that we've made. So now we have a nice CV flow. We've made the modification, moved the wheel flare out, and it looks pretty good. We have a nice uniform movement of all those CVs by setting the blend factors the same. Okay, now I'd like to show one more use of the blending options inside the Align tool. In this scenario, I have a roof surface and a sail panel. A design change has been requested that modifies that roof shape, but I've already spent a lot of time tuning the shape of this surface. So I'll turn the control vertices on, and I'll turn on some quick shading just so we can see a little bit that the surface has some specific shape. Okay? So I don't want to rebuild this surface. It's kind of one of my basic structures for what I've set up here. So I'd like to modify this surface and match it to this new edge. So to do that, we'll use the Object Edit Align. Okay. First, I'm going to align this surface to this edge and look at my partial values. So if I want it to be in about the same place on the new surface, I need to take note of these values. So we're just going to say it's 0.04 and 0.44. Okay? So I'm going to revert, so like there's no alignment. And I'm going to now request an alignment between this surface and this edge. So it doesn't move the surface because, like I mentioned in the previous scenario, it just measures the closest distance and snaps to that. But I can go over here in the partial options and change this to 0.04 and change this value to 0.44. So now it's fitting in about the same region of that surface as it did before the modification to the roof was made. Now I'd like to set the blending to control all of the control vertices. Okay, and I'd like 0 blend factor. So it's basically taken that surface and kind of moved it backwards and transformed all the CVs so that we have a similar shape. It's just been modified to fit to the new location. Now we have a small gap here. Maybe we could adjust our positional influence just a bit to let the software control where those CVs go. Okay. Another use of the blending options. In this lesson, you learned how to establish various levels of continuity between surfaces, effectively control tangent and curvature continuity, and utilize the partial and blend options to maintain form and uniform CV layouts.